22 miles. It doesn't seem like much. About the distance from Dodger Stadium to Disneyland. But what if we told you that 22 miles is also the distance between a world that's functioning normally and a world that's thrown into crisis? Sound implausible? Well, 22 miles is the distance between the shoreline in the Middle Eastern nation of Oman and the opposite shore in Iran. And you probably know that stretch of water as the Strait of Hormuz. No wars for oil. If you've been alive in the 21st century, you've heard that slogan over and over again. And we have some bad news. Regardless of how they start, a lot of wars kinda end up being about oil. World War I, Britain blockades Germany's oil supply, and it becomes one of the keys to Allied victory. World War II, the US cuts off Japan's supply of oil. And Pearl Harbor happens a few months later. In the 1970s, the US supports Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Arab nations cut off their oil exports to America in response. Gas prices rise nearly 300%, and an aide to President Nixon refers to it as an energy Pearl Harbor. In 2026, the United States attacks Iran, which, in response, shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, imperiling 20% of the world's oil supply, 25% of its liquid natural gas exports, and over a third of a crucial fertilizer needed for food production. In other words, it doesn't matter how a war begins. By the time it ends, there's a good chance it's going to be at least partially about energy. Unless it's the Falklands War, which no one knows what that was about. But here's where things get tricky. While there's an intimate relationship between energy and national security, it doesn't work the way that activists or pundits often suggest it does. For one thing, all those no war for oil chants kind of misunderstand the way that energy works. That slogan, after all, was at its most popular during the Iraq War, which you can kind of understand, since Iraq has some of the world's most extensive oil reserves. So, how much of Iraq's oil did the US end up taking? That would be none of it. Which is something you didn't really hear about at the time, but that these days, people on both the left and the right concede. Now, that wasn't because the American government was just being unusually charitable in Iraq. It was because the whole idea of taking the oil didn't even make sense. For a country like the United States, the goal is to keep international supplies of oil flowing. That keeps prices reasonably low and means that all the parts of the economy that depend on energy, which is virtually all of them, stay humming. Which is why, as experts pointed out at the time, if America's primary concern had been oil, the best thing we could have done was to avoid war with a country that was producing it. But this gets us to the critical distinction. While a country like the US wants to keep the global supply of energy flowing, a lot of other countries don't. At least not always. Why? Because in a lot of those countries, the government is the oil company. Here's what we mean. In America, when we talk about oil companies, we're talking about the likes of Chevron or ExxonMobil. In much of the rest of the world, when you talk about oil companies, you're talking about a corporation that is actually run by and is enriching the country's rulers, which is why the leadership in many of those countries lives so large, despite the fact that there's not a whole lot else happening in their economy. It's why Saudi Arabia looks like this. It's why Russia looks like this. And it's why Qatar looks like this. Norway is also a country where the state controls oil, by the way, but the best picture we could find of Norwegians flaunting their wealth was this. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but if the government owns the oil, wouldn't they just want to keep selling it and getting rich? And in most cases, the answer to that question is yes. But when the answer is no, it's for a very simple reason. Selling energy can make them lots of money, but withholding energy can get them lots of power. And if you doubt that principle, just ask Europe. Before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Moscow was the single largest supplier of natural gas exports to the continent. Some countries, like Austria and Latvia, depended on Russia for more than 80% of their gas supply. Then Russia cut off the pipelines in the hopes they could force those countries to abandon Ukraine. What followed was a continent-wide scramble. Factories went dark, households rationed heat, governments wrote emergency checks to keep people from freezing through the winter. European countries had to spend an amount almost equivalent to America's entire defense budget just to cushion the blow. And in 2026, we saw what can happen when it's the whole world being held hostage. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the International Energy Agency referred to it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. And the Dallas Federal Reserve projected that the strait staying closed would reduce the GDP of the entire world by nearly 3% in just the span of 90 days. To put that in context, the Great Recession reduced the GDP of the United States by a little over 4% over the course of 18 months. And this pattern repeats over and over again amongst our adversaries. Russia restricts natural gas. Iran restricts oil. North Korea restricts James Franco movies. Okay, that one may have actually been a favor. So, how do we handle a world where our enemies can dangle these threats over us? For a hopeful example, take a second look at what happened with Russia. In the end, Europe didn't fold to pressure from Moscow. They started getting more gas from friendly nations like the US, Norway, and Qatar. That process was a lot more painful and expensive than it would have been if they had planned ahead, but the lights still stayed on. And by early 2024, Russia's state gas company was nearly $7 billion in the red, its first annual loss in more than 20 years. Which points to the bigger lesson here. The best way to blunt our enemy's ability to put us or our allies in the dark is to make their energy resources less important. And experts have several recommendations on that front. Producing more energy here at home and selling more of it to our allies. Having countries that are dependent on energy imports diversify their trading partners so they're not reliant on hostile powers. And defending the vital pathways through which the world's energy travels, so that we avoid another shock like the Strait of Hormuz. Because we can't guarantee that our adversaries won't try to punish us again in the future. But we can guarantee that we'll be ready for them if they do. Unless it's another James Franco movie. In which case, just let them win.